Welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is the Before You Read lecture on Matthew chapters 8 through 20, which in many cases is the middle section of the Gospel of Matthew and a little bit more in order to make the weekly reading, a little bit more manageable. As with the previous Before You Read lectures, I want to provide a brief orientation to this material, pointing out a few places where you might pay attention more closely, as well as pointing out a few of the literary features that are significant for reading and interpreting the Gospel of Matthew. I want to start first with what is something that you may easily overlook, but if you take note, I think it's an important detail in the Gospel of Matthew. So at the section that we discussed in the last video lecture, chapter 7, at the very end of chapter 7, there is this line, and it seems innocent enough, it seems insignificant perhaps, but it's actually really significant. This is what it says in 7:28. Now, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astonished at his teaching. Matthew, the evangelist Matthew, inserts this phrase or modification of this phrase now when Jesus had finished doing such and such and such a thing, right? And usually it's a reference to his teaching or to his sayings. And Matthew inserts this in 5 places in the Gospel of Matthew. And this has led certain interpreters of the Gospel of Matthew to say, oh, what we have in Matthew, among all of the other material that Matthew has received from Mark and the stories of these healings and other things, is we have 5 discourses. We have 5 discourses. And why the number 5 is significant is that the first 5 books of the Old Testament were in Jewish tradition attributed to Moses. So just as Moses had 5 books of the Bible attributed to him, Jesus, who in many ways in the Gospel of Matthew is depicted as the new Moses, has 5 discourses. Whether or not you buy that explanation, it is a helpful way to identify these 5 discourses, and it certainly seems to be a textual marker that the evangelist Matthew has added for the sake of adding some coherence or some clarity to the gospel. So we see the next instance of this ending line in chapter 11, verse 1. We'll see it again in 13:53, and once again in 19:1 and 26:1. So be on the lookout for that small phrase, a seemingly insignificant phrase that actually carries a lot of weight in the Gospel of Matthew. The second sort of broad thing that I want to say about this material is we really are in the second part of the Gospel of Matthew, and we will read into the beginning of the third part. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, again, Matthew has inserted these important textual markers in the narrative that provide this threefold structure to his gospel. So if you look back again at 4:17, this is an important place. 4:17, it says, "From that time, Jesus began to proclaim." So from that time, Jesus began to do something. And so this introduces the second major section of the Gospel of Matthew, which is usually described as the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus or something to that. And then everything before it is sort of the background of Jesus. It's the genealogy and the birth narrative and the temptation and the baptism. So that's part 1. Chapter 1 through 17 is part 1. Part 2 starts in 4:18 and it goes until 16:21. Now again, if you flip ahead in your Bibles to 16:21, we see a similar phrase. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised again. And so this little textual marker sounds very similar to the one in 417, and it really marks the third part of Matthew's gospel, which concerns the crucified Jesus. Jesus' long path to Jerusalem and the unimaginable events that will happen there, including his suffering, death, and resurrection. So I wanted to highlight just those three breaks because they're important. And so the reading for this week, chapters 8 through 20, really will conclude our middle section and lead into part 3 of the Gospel of Matthew. So when you look at this material that we have under consideration, the first thing that you'll notice is that chapters 8 and 9 are just bursting with healing narratives. Now, there are healing narratives that occur elsewhere in the Gospel of Matthew, but it seems as though Matthew has really grouped them together, really consolidated them together. This is one of the things that we notice about the way that Matthew tells the story, is a tendency to be a little bit more systematic in the portrait, in the story of Jesus. Whereas Mark, we might think of as, healing story here and controversy story here and some teaching there. Matthew offers a little bit more a line, a little bit more grouping together of similar material. In chapter 10, we read a variety of teachings about discipleship. And this is described according to 11:1 as the Discourse on Discipleship. What does it mean to be Jesus' disciple? And this is all about attitudes of the disciples as well as some of the resistance that they will face because they are the disciples of Jesus. In chapter 13, we have another discourse, and this is variously referred to as a discourse on parables. Again, Matthew has consolidated these parables for the most part in chapter 13. He's brought them all together. It makes it easier to sort of read them all together as opposed to them being spread out more willy-nilly. In chapter 18, we encounter another discourse. This one is known as the Discourse on the Church. 18:15 references the church. The Greek word for church is ekklesia, and it is the only reference to the church in all of the Gospels. Paul's letters talk about the church or churches in several places, but this is the only place where the church is mentioned, and it's mentioned in the discourse of Jesus. This has given scholars of the New Testament a lot of reason to think that Matthew has a community behind it that presents itself more clearly than perhaps the community first addressed by the Gospel of Mark. There seems to be a crisis in the community. There's a crisis in that ecclesia, and it has in particular to do with their relationship to Judaism. As my advisor Luke Timothy Johnson would say, there is a crisis with the synagogue down the street. So that the community that Matthew is written to is still very familiar with the synagogue, very familiar with Jewish practices. They themselves may be ethnically Jewish, but who have come to believe that Jesus is in fact the Messiah and Son of God. And as a result of that confession, as a result of aligning themselves with the movement associated with Jesus, they've been rejected by that synagogue down the street. And they're experiencing some turmoil and some separation from that community and all of the social and economic consequences that would come with that. I've provided a sort of overview of this material, of the various discourses, the three discourses that we will confront in these chapters, as well as some of Matthew's process of systematizing, of grouping stuff together. So what should you look for as you read? What are some strategies for reading? The first thing I think will focus your reading concerns the portrait of the disciples. You'll remember that in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are, almost without exception, dunderheads. They cannot get who Jesus is. even though they're a part of his inner circle, even those who are part of the inner circle fail to grasp who he is. And they actually, all of his male disciples identify him, or abandon him rather, in his moment of greatest need. So as you read this section of Matthew, you might ask, does the portrait of the disciples in Matthew improve at all? Are they portrayed in a more sympathetic manner? Or is it just as harsh as the Gospel of Mark? A second thing to be on the lookout for is Jesus' interactions with non-Jews. Remember, there are elements of the Gospels that seem to be very clear that Jesus was a Jewish male himself and was primarily interested in ministering and preaching to other members, other ethnically Jewish folks. And so as you read this section of Matthew, be on the lookout for Jesus' interactions with non-Jews. And what does that say about the personality and the character of Jesus? Finally, I invite you to spend some time with the sea miracle in Matthew chapter 14. This is a classic example of the ways in which Matthew is retelling a very basic story of Jesus. You'll know that Jesus walks on water and performs these sea miracles in Mark's gospel, but Matthew elaborates on it. And Matthew elaborates on it with the role of Peter, and you may remember that this is the place where we see Peter walking on water, and he begins to sink. But the really important, the climactic moment of this story is that Jesus gets back into the boat and he calms the sea. And it's in the boat that the disciples bow down and worship Jesus. And they say, "Truly you are the Son of God." Now remember, in the Gospel of Mark, that doesn't happen until the scene of the crucifixion, and it's a centurion who makes this declaration. And up until that point, no human being grasps who Jesus is. But in this healing miracle in Matthew 14, the human disciples get it. They may not hold on to it long, but they get it. And the really significant thing is that they worship Jesus. They worship him in the boat, even though the boat is in a place of peril, a place of danger. And certain New Testament scholars turn to Matthew 14 and they see it as a sort of symbol for the church that is imagined by the Gospel of Matthew. This is a community that experiences its gatherings together, experiences itself as being in a time of turmoil, of crisis, and danger. But it's also the place, it is also the community that is worshiping Jesus as the living God, that is worshiping Jesus as the Son of God. And so they see this image of the boat with the disciples surrounded by a tumultuous sea as an image or a symbol for the Matthean community, for the community that is experiencing this turmoil and danger from their previous religious communities. So spend some time noticing the ways that Matthew develops that story, and does so perhaps with the community in mind. Well, as we continue our reading of the Gospel of Matthew, I hope that this overview and these questions provide plenty of avenues for your fruitful engagement with the Gospel of Matthew. I look forward to our fruitful discussion. Now get to reading.